الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين شفيع المذنبين وحبيب قلوب الصادقين سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد فقد قال الله عز وجل في القرآن المجيد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وكذلك جعلناكم أمة وسطا لتكونوا شهداء على الناس ويكون الرسول عليكم شهيدا صلوا على محمد وآل محمد
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
For the last few nights we have been discussing one of the important elements of the teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam, and one of those factors which in reality is a matter of pride and a matter of distinction for the followers of Ahlul Bayt among all of the schools of thought within religion, within Islam, and among all of the other religions of the world as well. You will not find an example of a religion that encourages its followers to find moderation and balance by becoming more religious, to be able to make peace and bring harmony between all of the elements of their fitrah, their emotional, their physical, their spiritual, and their intellectual needs. All of them, they have a place, they have a respect and an honor in Islam. And we do not need to escape from our religion in order to be able to meet any one of these needs. The teachings of our religion, they give us an instruction about what it is that is the best way for us to use those different faculties and those different tests that Allah has placed within our existence. And these are of two types. Some of them are general tests, and some of them are specific to some of us, but they might not be universal. Those which are universal are part of our fitrah. It is part of our fitrah to always want to be able to have a legacy. It means that we wish that we could live in this world forever. Every human being has that nature of self-preservation. At the first instance, when we want to preserve ourselves, it means that we want to make sure that we can stay alive. And in some cases, we may even give ourselves precedence and sacrifice the well-being of others or overlook the well-being of others in order to further our own interests. As a person becomes more mature, as a person ages, then that same desire for self-preservation can take a slightly different form. When a person becomes a parent and has children, then they see their own well-being, their own future, their own success, and their own legacy in the well-being of their children. And that is also part of human nature, but it is the same basic desire. It is a form of eternal life or lasting material life that we are looking for. But part of our fitrah and our upbringing and our culture is that we see that preservation to take place through our children. In some cases it might be through certain actions that we can do. We like it when we have honor in society and people know that I was the one who discovered or invented or created or innovated or helped or did something great for another person or for society. That is part of our human fitrah. In this case, Islam will never say that something that is within your human fitrah is wrong. If there is a natural human desire to get married, if there is a natural human desire to have children and to raise those children and make them flourish, if there is a natural human desire to have a good reputation and to be recognized for our good works in society, not to be always condemned and known for our shortcomings and our mistakes, if there is a natural human need in the physical realm or in the emotional realm, it's natural for a person to show grief at certain times, then none of those natural needs will ever be denied by Islam. Yes, all of them will be regulated, so that we don't think that those parts of our fitrah tell us the entire story. Islam will encourage us to preserve our curiosity, preserve our admiration for what is beautiful. But it will tell us that don't waste your curiosity in things that are not going to give you any benefit. You can exercise your curiosity by doing research about history and finding out your genealogy and finding out so many things that are only going to be of academic interest. Islam says that don't waste your time. Find out your genealogy to the extent that it will help you preserve and maintain your family relations. If you study your family origins, so that you might be able to be reunited with a family member, a relative, an uncle or aunt, or a cousin that you didn't know about, or that you had lost touch with, then because it has an effect on your life, on your actions, that is good. But don't waste your curiosity in those things that are not going to have any benefit for you. Similarly, if you have an admiration for beauty, then there is much beauty in what Allah has created, in the physical world, in terms of our senses, foods and sounds that we hear, and fragrances that we will smell. All of these parts of the created world have beauty. But Islam will tell us two things. That first, appreciate that beauty not for itself, but as an ayah and as a sign for the one who placed that beauty in creation and created it. So always see Allah when you see the creatures, the creation, and the beauty of what Allah has made within the world. And second, don't think that this is the extent of the creation and the wisdom and the beauty of Allah and His actions in the world. Appreciate that the source of all that exists is far more beautiful, far more worthy of our admiration than the creation itself. So when there are certain things that are general to the human fitrah, Islam will tell us how it is that we can best honor those parts of our fitrah. If there is a religion or a school of thought that suppresses or that denies a natural part of the human fitrah, then that should be enough for you to reject that school of thought. If there is a school of thought, and they may claim to be Muslim, and they may claim to have a hadith of the Prophet or an interpretation of a verse of Quran, but if it goes against general human nature, which is not limited to one society, to one historical time period, to one culture, to one era, and not to another era or another people, but something that is part of human nature. And all of us, through our experiences and our interactions with other people and our study and our knowledge of history in other societies, we have an appreciation of what are those elements of the human fitrah. If a school of thought comes and it denies a portion of that fitrah, then that should be sufficient for us to reject that school of thought. That was not the sunnah of the Prophet. In fact, the Prophet took a very strong stance against those people who said that you worship Allah by hiding or covering or shielding any one portion of your fitrah. There are many ahadith of the Prophet to that effect. One hadith of our Prophet Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He says, "An-nikahu sunnati, faman raghiba an sunnati, falaysa minni." Marriage is my sunnah. To get married, and then to honor that bond of marriage, and all of the natural results and consequences that come from that bond, which means to give importance to one's spouse, to one's children, to one's in-laws, and all of those relationships and all of those obligations that come from marriage. That is the sunnah of the Prophet. To make an effort to be able to honor that commandment, to practice that commandment, and to honor those relationships, that is the sunnah of the Prophet. And if a person comes and says that, well, no, I want to worship, I want to just devote my life to Allah, or if a person devotes his or her life to a career, or to academic pursuits, or says that I want to serve the community, and in doing so, then I will ignore the sunnah of the Prophet, I won't get married, or I will set aside my family. And the Prophet says, فَمَنْ رَغِبَ عَنْ سُنَّتِي فَلَيْسَ مِنِّي. If a person turns his or her back to my sunnah, they're not from me. They might think that they are being very self-sacrificing, they're being altruistic, they're doing a very good thing, but they are not following the sunnah and the practice of the Prophet. So Islam says, and the teaching of our Prophet and Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam are that every part of the human fitrah, its needs, what it finds peace and tranquility in, its hopes and its aspirations, they are put there by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we are to respect and to honor them. So this is one type of a reality that we have within ourselves. General parts of the human fitrah, these are not specific to one person or another person. There are some things, however, which are not general to all people, but they are elements that might be specific to an individual or to a small group of people. Now here we have certain types of false teachings that exist among some religions, and I want to speak in general, but many of you may be familiar with some of the religious groups which hold these opinions, and they can sometimes influence us as Muslims as well. But they are opposed to the teachings of Islam. It might be possible, for example, that I am a person who likes to take risks. And so I am very attracted to any kind of a new activity that is very risky. Whether it be gambling, or whether it be a risky recreational activity, skydiving or bungee jumping or something of that nature. Another person might not be attracted to any of those activities at all. They can pass by an opportunity to go bungee jumping, and even if it were offered for free, even if somebody were to pay them for it, they wouldn't want to do it. They would pass by a casino and they wouldn't once be tempted to go and try their luck. For other people, it will be not just temptation, but it will be as if there's a magnetic force pulling them to test their luck, to try their hand and see what they might be able to obtain. So what is our belief about these kinds of tendencies when it comes to attraction and what we are attracted to, what we are tempted towards? Not every human being is equal to or is the same as another human being. Now, in many of these cases, we cannot say that this is part of the human fitrah. If it were part of the human fitrah, if it were part of the human nature, the divine nature that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created for us, then it would not be exclusive to one or a small group of people. It would be something that is general. The false teaching that exists about some of these attributes is that this is something which comes from shaitan. This is something that is a pathology. It is a disease. It is a sickness. It is an evil thing that does not have any divine origin. And then people who are dealing with those issues, they sometimes say that if Allah did not want me to act on this attraction that I have, to act on this desire that I have, then why did He create me in this way? Why did Allah create me with this temptation if He did not want me to act on it? Now, what is the Islamic perspective? We don't believe that anything that exists within creation is without a purpose. If there is something that I have chosen, then that might be from shaitan. If there is something that I have chosen, then that might be my responsibility. So if I have disobeyed my conscience and my Creator and the wisdom of those who wished me well, and I associated with bad company, and now I fell prey to a certain sin, even though now I might feel that this is beyond my own control and beyond my own hands, it is still my responsibility. There is a principle in Islam that al-ittiraru bisu'i al-ikhtiyar la yunafi al-ikhtiyar. That if you are compelled because of your own wrongdoing and your own mischief, then you can't say that, well, I didn't have a choice. It was something that was beyond my control. You had a choice in putting yourself in that situation, and you had a responsibility to avoid that situation. But if it's something that was not by my choice, maybe it was a mistake that was made by my parents, the environment that I was born in, that I was schooled in, something that was outside of my control, outside of my awareness. Maybe it was circumstances that were beyond the control even of my parents. There were other factors that were beyond my control. What does Islam say about these types of trials and tests that exist within our life? And we can familiarize ourselves, maybe in our own lives, maybe in the lives of our friends and our community members, our children. These types of issues also do exist. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Some religions will tell you that this is something which you are to see as against human nature, as almost being a mistake, na'udhu billah, in God's creation. But what Islam tells us is a very profound and a very sophisticated theological point. Islam says that every human being has been given a unique and an individual challenge by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The type of temptation, the type of that call that shaitan makes, that might be different for every person. But both the test, the temptation, and the strength to reject the temptation and tune out the call of shaitan, that is found in every human being. If you look at the way the Quran describes the interaction of Prophet Lut with his people, then you see this point that I'm making illustrated very, very beautifully. Prophet Lut was in a society that was far more corrupt, far more sinful, even we can say than the society that we live in. Many of the same types of superficial sins and temptations, they exist in this society just as they existed in the time of Prophet Lut as well. But one major difference is that in the time of Prophet Lut alayhi salam and in his society, people took pride in their criminality. In other words, when visitors would come into the city and people would attack them and pillage them and molest them, then they would take pride and publicize those events. Now, we live in a society that has various forms of corruption, but there is still a sense of rule of law. There is still a sense of justice, of live and let live. And so, by degrees, if we are to compare, that is a society that was much more corrupt. Now look at how the Quran says that Prophet Lut alayhi salatu wasalam dealt with those people. He didn't say that I have nothing to say with you, that I have nothing to respond to you, that I will dismiss you. He didn't say that I am going to abandon you, but he came to them and he said that you have these natural tendencies, these desires, and you have certain desires which are being used and being understood in an unnatural way. And Prophet Lut said that Allah has given you a legitimate way to answer what desires and what needs you as a human being have. And he invited them towards taharat and towards purity and towards marriage. So he never said that I am not going to be able to speak with you and I am going to completely boycott anything to do with you. This is the teaching of Islam. That whether it be those general parts of the human fitrah that every human being has, or whether it be those specific tests that I might have which you do not share, or which you may have that I do not share, all of them have been placed within our existence according to a divine wisdom. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us a certain temptation, if Allah has given permission to shaitan to whisper something into our ears, then it is also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who has given us the strength to respond to shaitan and say that we are not going to follow and to answer his call, and that we are going to abandon him. And so in Islam, we don't need to question Allah and say that, why did He create me in this way? Allah created you in this way so that you are able to decide and overcome whatever weaknesses you might have. And in reality, there is no difference between those general aspects of our human nature and those individual aspects of our human nature. All of them are challenges that we have to understand and we have to channel and utilize in the correct way, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has shown us how it is that we may be able to do so. Sallu ala Muhammad wa alihi. The verse of Quran which I recited is in Surah Al-Baqarah, and it talks about this dimension of Islamic teaching, of its balance and of its being in the middle, in the state of moderation. Allah says that He has created this ummah in a certain way. He has made this ummah a certain type of ummah. وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ وَيَكُونَ الرَّسُولُ عَلَيْكُمْ شَهِيدًا. Allah says that I have made you a moderate, a fair, a just nation, a just community, a moderate community, ummatan wasata. لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ, so that you might be witnesses for people, for members of other religious communities. Show them what is moderation. When Muslims stand before non-Muslims, then we must always be able to show through our lives the richness and the beauty of our Islamic teachings. People should never look at Muslims and recoil with disgust. That what kind of a religion, what kind of a people, what kind of beliefs and what kind of practices do they have? We are to fulfill a mission for humanity. And if you look throughout society, in fact, some of you may be familiar with the incident when our fifth Imam, Imam Muhammad Baqir alayhi salatu wassalam, he went to Syria. Several incidents are narrated about that journey. Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam, he was with his father, the fifth Imam, during that journey as a young child. When Imam Baqir went to Syria, there was a gathering that joined the fifth Imam with a very famous, well-known ascetic, a pious person from the Christian community. And when they came together in one gathering, that Christian monk, he asked a question to the fifth Imam. Now, the nature of the gathering was this. Syria at that time was not a Muslim majority country. The Muslims were a sizable population, but they were not the majority of the residents of Syria at that time. Islam was still spreading. Many of the tribes, Arab tribes and non-Arab tribes, they were not Muslim. In this particular gathering, it was mostly Christians who had an interest in coming and learning from and visiting and seeing this saint. Just as today, if the Pope is going to hold a Mass, mostly it will be Catholics who will go. And maybe there will be some representatives or some diplomats or some ambassadors from other religious communities or other countries who may be present. If a Muslim scholar is going to hold an audience, then mostly the masses will be Muslim. The masses of Christians or Jews or other religions, they're not going to be motivated to attend. But there might be some dignitaries from other religious communities who will come. So this was the nature of that gathering. When that Christian laid eyes on Imam Muhammad Baqir alayhi salatu wassalam, he asked him a question. He said, "Are you a Christian? Am hal anta min al-ummati al-marhuma? Or are you from that ummah which has been shown rahmah and mercy by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?" That was the name by which the neighbors of the Muslims knew the Muslims in that time. Al-ummatul marhuma, the ummah that has been shown mercy. And why was it the case? Because the religious communities of that time, the various sects of Christianity, the various sects of other religions, they were never able to live with respect and with dignity with one another. It was only when the Muslims came that they had a certain amount of justice and stability that allowed them to live in peace. In many cities where the Muslim armies came, it was the inhabitants of that city who said, "Free us from the tyranny of our emperors, our governors, our kings, and bring us into your protection." So he said to the Imam, "Am anta min al-ummatil marhuma." Are you a member of that ummah that has been shown mercy? Now, this was a time when Islam had already departed very far from the ideals of the Prophet. We are not talking about the era of the Prophet of Islam. We're not even talking about the era of the Khulafa'i Rashidun, who many Muslims regard as being second after the Prophet in terms of how good things were in the Muslim world. Things had degenerated by this time. We're talking about the Umayyad kingdom. But still, they were so much better than what was familiar to the members of other religions that they would say there must be a divine mercy that is attached to the Muslim Ummah. Because they have an element of humanity. They have an element of compassion. So this is the ideal that we are to strive for as a community, that we can be witnesses before other religious communities. وَيَكُونَ الرَّسُولُ عَلَيْكُمْ شَهِدًا. And the Prophet is to be a witness for us, for what is right. On the Day of Judgment, the Prophet will be a witness before us, and we will be a witness before the other religious communities and the other nations. With regard to this verse, there are several points that we can discuss. I want to just discuss one point today, and inshallah we will look at the tafsir and the meanings of these words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in more detail. But one point, which is a matter of discussion among the scholars and the mufassirin of different schools of thought. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The question is this: how can we be a ummatan wasata? How can we be that ummah that is in the middle? If you look around the world today, there are secular Muslims, there are traditionalist Muslims, there are fundamentalist Muslims, there are elitist Muslims, there are Salafi Muslims, there are Sufi Muslims. Not all of these labels are good labels. Not all of these labels are meaningful labels, and I'm not using them in order to legitimate them and say that these labels have any real meaning. But these are labels that exist. Some of them describe groups within the Muslim community. So you find a great deal of difference among Muslims. There are some who call themselves Islamist. There are some who don't like that label, Islamist. There are some who say that I am a Muslim from this school of thought or another school of thought. There are some who say that I am just Muslim. All of these different groups, all of these different labels, all of these different philosophies. Now, you and I who are Muslim and are intimately familiar both with the religion of Islam and the teachings of Islam, where can we say that we are a ummah wasat, a just or a fair or a moderate ummah? The different translations right now, I'm not trying to specify one translation or one tafsir over another, but that meaning of this ummah, which is supposed to be able to be a witness for other nations, which is supposed to be an example for other nations, is that something that you and I can say that yes, of course, it's very easy? Obviously, it cannot be the whole ummah. So then the question comes, and this is not a Shia tafsir or a Sunni tafsir or a Sufi tafsir. This is something which every Muslim would have to accept. That if this ummah is to be a just and a fair and a moderate ummah, then it cannot be the entire ummah. Because the entire ummah includes many who are very extreme, who are very far away from justice, who are very far away from moderation, who are sinners, who are oppressors. So if it is not the entire ummah, then it must be part of the ummah. The question comes, then how do we determine what is that subgroup of the ummah that is going to be fulfilling this divine obligation, this important divine rank? It's one thing for us to say that it is the entire ummah. وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ. That all of you are fair. All of you are just. All of you are moderate. If we had said that, or if we were able to say that, then it would be very easy for us to say that the entire ummah is being referred to, and the entire ummah is an example for the non-Muslims. The entire ummah will testify before Allah about the non-Muslims. But when we cannot say that, because we know that the entire ummah is not worthy of that rank, then what is it that is going to define which group within the ummah is going to be fulfilling this divine role and responsibility? This is where the teaching of Ahlul Bayt becomes very, very important. The tafsir of Ahlul Bayt is that if you want to know which part of the ummah is going to be fulfilling this responsibility, then look at the a'imma which that group follows. Because it is always going to be the case that people will make mistakes. It is always going to be the case that people will have deficiencies, struggles, shortcomings, sins, and then they will make up for those sins and try to become better. And sometimes they will have setbacks and they will move backwards. If you want to know the reality of any group within the ummah, then look at their a'imma. And by their leaders, by their role models, by their examples, you will know where they fit with respect to this divine promise. Now, this is a principle that allows us to understand that although this verse is speaking about the ummah, it is not a static verse. A static verse means that it's not just describing the ummah in one particular time, but it's telling us that the ummah needs to have a certain direction. The ummah, it needs to have a certain momentum. The ummah, it needs to have a certain ideal and then be moving in the direction of that ideal. And if you and I are worried about the state of the ummah, and if you and I are worried about all of those people who are making false teachings and attributing them to Islam, if you and I are worried about the nature of all of those different kinds of deviation that have crept into the ummah, then the tafsir of this verse can tell us how it is that we can solve that problem. Find a'imma who are worthy of being followed, and you will begin to see how it is that the affairs of the ummah themselves can become rectified. But if you don't have worthy role models, and if you don't have worthy a'imma and imams, then it is not going to be possible for you to right the ship of the ummah altogether. You might be able to make some minor repairs here and there, but that will just be patching up mistakes. It will be treating the symptoms and not treating the cause of the illness. So this was the tafsir of the verse of Surah Al-Baqarah as we have it from Ahlul Bayt. When you want to see how to achieve that moderation of religion, when you want to see how to achieve the comprehensive teachings of religion, then the most important thing for you to do is to have a'imma who are worthy of being followed. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now, I want to make one final point in tonight's talk, and inshallah we will continue the discussion in our future sessions. When we talk about the different schools of thought and the different labels within Islam, there are people who draw their own boundaries as to where the red lines or the yellow lines or the borders of our loyalties and our community are to be found. As a follower of Ahlul Bayt, we take a great deal of pride in the fact that the Ummah is defined by its A'imma. And if somebody says that I follow Abu Hanifa, there is absolutely no reason for any follower of Ahlul Bayt to look down on that person in any way. Because Abu Hanifa was a scholar of fiqh. He had memorized the fiqhi opinions, the legal opinions of his teachers and many scholars, and that was his area of expertise. There is no reason for a person to look down on that person. If somebody follows a particular school of law, a particular school of theology, of aqa'id, a particular scholar that they admire, there is no reason to look down on that person. Yes, it is a matter of pride for followers of Ahlul Bayt that when it comes to kalam or aqa'id, when it comes to akhlaq and irfan, when it comes to fiqh and law and practices and adab and all of our affairs, we have role models who were peerless, not just in one of those areas, but not another, but in all of those areas together, who were known as Baqirul Ulum, the ones who would open up the springs and the hidden treasures of the knowledge of the Prophet for all of the Ummah to become aware of. But the question is that if the ayah of Quran wanted to say that the role of the Ummah can only be fulfilled through the Imams, then wouldn't it have been easier for the Quran not to use the word Ummah and to use the word A'imma? They're very similar in Arabic. Ummah and A'imma. Ummah means the nation, and A'imma means the leaders. Yes, in order to understand the nature of the Ummah and how the Ummah can become not just an inert and a stationary group of people, but can become a directed group that is marching towards a common destiny, you need to know who are the leaders and the role models and the inspiration of that Ummah. That is necessary. But that doesn't change the fact that Allah did not say A'imma, He said Ummah. And this is a very important point for us to remember. Allah wanted those who have the very best A'imma to become part of and remain part of and be a source of inspiration and assistance to the remaining members of the nation as well. That direction should come from a place of sympathy and loyalty and identification, not from somebody standing outside and criticizing. It's a very fine point, but a very important point. If you look, sometimes if you want to do research in books, in YouTube clips, then you will have people who spread hate. They wish to divide the Muslim Ummah. They will say that if you are not a Salafi, then you are not a true member of Ahlul Sunnah. All of those Sunnis who respect their Sufi scholars, their Pirs, their Murshids, then they're not true members of Ahlul Sunnah. And they will have animosity and hatred against them. There will be other groups that will say the border is between Sunni and Shia. These are two separate groups, and they will not mix. But the teaching of our school of thought is that although imamat is essential for salvation and for spiritual and religious advancement, the ummah is the ummah. And all parts of the ummah, with our strengths and with our beliefs, we are to give our hands to one another to help each other create a better society and achieve our purpose that has been given to the entire ummah. Imam Ali never said that I am the Imam of one group of the ummah. Imam Hasan never said that I am the Imam of one part of the ummah. Imam Hussein never said that I am the Imam of just one part of the ummah. And that is why the commemoration and the mourning of Imam Hussein ﷺ is something that the entire ummah joins together in participating of. A Shia cannot say that the mourning of Imam Hussein and the remembrance of Imam Hussein belongs to me and not to the Sunni. A Sunni cannot say that Imam Hussein belongs to me and not to a Shia. This is something which is part of the Islamic ummah and the Islamic heritage. And when it comes to specific teachings of Islam as well, we find that the teachings of Ahlul Bayt are very clear. They say that if there is any Muslim who dies, then don't ask what was their school of thought. If they said La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah and they had a love of Allah and His Prophet, then go and participate in their janazah. Don't ask, were they Sunni or were they Shia? Were they a member of this group or that group? If the adhan is called in any masjid and the adhan contains the shahada, La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah, then go and join that jama'at. Clear teachings of our imams and the fatwa of our scholars. Now yes, there might be some schools of thought that will question and say, well, I don't know if you can pray behind a Barelvi, I don't know if you can pray behind a Devbandi, I don't know if you can pray behind a Sufi, I don't know if you can pray behind a Shia. Let them stay confused. Let them stay with their prejudices or whatever they may wish to have. The hadith of Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam is that when you join another school of thought and you pray with them in the first row, then it is as if you are fighting in the first row in a battle against the enemies of Islam. And in reality, you are fighting in a battle against the enemies of Islam, because you are taking away those walls and those curtains of prejudice and hatred that some people wish to erect within the ummah. That is the teaching of our imam. Now, does that jama'at have certain rules? Yes. Is it important for us to properly fulfill our obligation, pray as Islam taught us to pray? Yes. It doesn't mean that you go and you follow whatever school of thought is prevalent within a certain area, that when you are with one group, pray like they do, and when you are with another group, pray like they do. No, pray as you have been taught and pray as you consider to be correct, but join their jama'at. Pray with them according to your school of thought. And when they join you, then don't ask them to pray like you, but invite them to join your jama'at. The journey of Imam Hussein alayhi salatu wassalam to Karbala gives us an illustration of that beautiful type of interaction. Just one question that I wish to ask you to think about. That on the way to Karbala, you know that when the Imam was traveling together with the army of Hur ibn Yazid, who was the appointee of Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad, and the time for adhan came, the Imam said that, Hur, it is time for prayer. I give you the option of leading your men, and I will lead my men. And then when Hur said that you are the grandson of the Messenger of Allah, we will join you in prayer. The Imam gave that honor and that respect to Hur, that he recognized that he was the commander of his contingent. He gave a certain dignity to a person who was his enemy. Tomorrow we will talk about the story of Hur, and it is a very beautiful and a very inspiring story, but from two angles. One is the angle of the change that came in that enemy soldier. The other is the beauty of the interaction of Imam Hussein with his adversary. مومنین و مومنات، آج محرم کی دوسری تاریخ تھی. یہی وہ دن تھا جب عصمت و طہارت کا قافلہ اپنی منزل پہ پہنچا. وہ قافلہ جو 28 رجب کو مدینے سے روانہ ہوا تھا اب عراق میں آ پہنچا ہے. اور کتنا لمبا سفر تھا، منزلیں طے کرتے کرتے اب جب یہ قافلہ خاک کربلا پہ پہنچا ہے تو لمبے سفر کے بعد عام طور پہ جب سفر تمام ہوتا ہے تو مسافر کو خوشی ہوتی ہے، اطمینان ہوتی ہے، سکون ہوتا ہے کہ اب سفر کی تکالف دور ہوگی. لیکن یہ عجیب سفر تھا کربلا والوں کو، یہ عجیب سفر تھا کربلا والوں کا کہ جب ان کا سفر تمام ہوا تو نہ حسین کو سکون ہے، نہ زینب کو سکون ہے، نہ ام کلثوم کو سکون ہے. مقاتل میں لکھا ہے کہ امام کا گھوڑا چلتے چلتے ایک منزل پہ آ کے رک گیا اور پھر اس سے آگے نہیں بڑھا. امام نے مقامی لوگوں سے دریافت کیا کہ مسم هذا المکان، اس جگہ کا نام کیا ہے. اب امام کے اصحاب میں کچھ تھے جو واقف تھے، امام کے اصحاب میں کچھ ایسے بھی سپاہی تھے جو امیر المومنین کی صفین کی فوج میں شامل تھے، اور ان کو یاد تھا کہ جیسے مسند احمد ابن حنبل کی روایت ہے کہ راہ صفین میں کربلا کے مقام پہ آ کے امام نے مرثیہ پڑھا تھا اور امیر المومنین نے کہا تھا صبرن یا ابی عبداللہ بشط الفرات، اے میرے بیٹے حسین جب فرات کے کنارے آنا تو صبر کرنا. روایت میں ملتا ہے کہ زہیر ابن قین آگے بڑھے، کہا مولا نہ پوچھئے اس جگہ کا نام کیا ہے، آگے بڑھتے چلتے ہیں، آگے بڑھئے نہ پوچھئے. امام نے کہا کہ بتائیے اس خطے کا نام کیا ہے؟ تو کسی نے کہا یقال لها الطف، اس کو طف کہتے ہیں. امام نے کہا کہ هل لها اسم آخر، کیا کوئی اور نام بھی ہے؟ تو کسی نے کہا اس کو شط الفرات کہتے ہیں. امام نے کہا اور کوئی نام ہے؟ کسی نے کہا اس کو غابریہ بھی کہتے ہیں. امام نے کہا کہ اور کوئی نام ہے؟ کسی نے کہا غابریہ بھی کہتے ہیں. امام ایک خاص نام کی تلاش میں تھے. ایک بوڑھا تھا، وہ آگے بڑھا، اس نے کہا میں نے اپنے بزرگوں سے سنا ہے کہ اس خطے کا ایک اور نام بھی ہے، اس کو کربلا بھی کہتے ہیں. بس یہ نام سننا تھا. امام کی آنکھوں میں آنسو آ گئے. امام نے کہا اعوذ باللہ من الکرب والبلا، میں اللہ کی پناہ مانگتا ہوں کرب و مصیبت و بلا سے. پھر امام اپنی سواری سے نیچے اترے اور کربلا کی خاک کا ایک مٹھی اپنے ہاتھ میں لی اور اس کو سونگا اور کہا کہ ہاں یہ وہی مہک ہے جو حجرہ ام سلمہ نے، مجھے یاد ہے کہ جب جبرائیل پیغمبر پہ نازل ہوئے اور ایک شیشے میں کربلا کی خاک پیغمبر کو پیش کی تو یہی مہک تھی. پھر امام نے کہا کہ ہاں ہونا مناخ رکابنا ومحط رحالنا ومسفک دمائنا، یہیں پر ہمارے خیمے لگیں گے، یہیں پر ہمارا خون بہایا جائے گا، یہیں پر ہماری قبریں بنیں گی. امام نے حکم دیا کہ القمہ فرات کے کنارے خیمے لگائے جائیں. جب خیمے لگ گئے تو پھر ہر آگے بڑھا، کہا کہ میرے امیر کا حکم ہے کہ امام کے خیمے فرات کے کنارے نہ لگیں، ان کو یہاں سے ہٹا دیجئے. امام نے حضرت ابو الفضل کو حکم دیا کہ خیموں کو ہٹا دیا جائے. جناب ابو الفضل نے اپنی تلوار کے نیام پہ ہاتھ ڈالا, کہا مولا اذن جنگ دیجئے, کس کی مجال ہے کہ آل رسول کے خیموں کو پانی سے دور کر دے. مولا نے کہا کہ عباس اگر میں اذن جہاد دے دوں تو پھر حر کو جہنم سے کون نجات دے گا. خیموں کو ہٹا دیا گیا, علقمہ سے دور کسی مقام پر دوبارہ خیمے لگائے گئے, محملیں اتاری گئیں. اب جب زینب ام کلثوم اپنے سواریوں سے اتری اور اپنے خیمے میں گئیں تو ام کلثوم کے دل میں ایک خاص اضطراب تھا, لیکن بیان نہیں کیا. دیکھ رہی تھیں کہ امام کیا کر رہے ہیں. امام نے بنی اسد کے قبیلے والوں کو بلایا اپنے پاس اور ایک خاص وصیت کی. کہا کہ میں اس زمین کو آپ سے خریدنا چاہتا ہوں. تو امام نے وہ زمین بنی اسد سے خریدی اور پھر امام نے فرمایا کہ میں یہ زمین تمہیں دوبارہ ہدیہ کرتا ہوں, ہبہ کرتا ہوں, 2 شرطوں کے ساتھ. ایک شرط یہ ہے کہ میری شہادت کے بعد جو بھی زائر آئے 3 دن وہ تمہارا مہمان رہے گا. اور پھر ایک اور شرط رکھی امام نے فرمایا کہ جب ہم شہید ہو جائیں گے تو ہماری قبریں بنا کے ہمیں دفنا دینا. اور پھر بھی امام کو اطمینان نہیں ہوا. کہا کہ بنی اسد کی عورتوں کو بلایا جائے. عورتیں آئیں امام کی خدمت میں. امام نے پھر عورتوں کو خطاب کر کے کہا کہ اگر تمہارے مرد ہمیں دفن نہ کرے تو پھر ایک گڑھا کھود لیجئے گا اور ہماری لاشوں کو ایک ساتھ دفن کر دے. پھر بھی امام کو اطمینان نہیں آیا. کہا کہ بچوں کو بلایا جائے. کھیلتے کھیلتے بنی اسد کے چھوٹے بچے سامنے آئے. امام نے کہا ہے بنی اسد کے بچوں, اگر تمہارے مرد اور عورتیں ہمیں دفن نہ کریں تو جب تم صحرا میں جا کے کھیلا کرو تو ایک ایک مشت خاک ڈال کر ہماری لاشوں پہ ڈال دیا کرے تاکہ ہمیں دفنا دیا جائے. یہ امام کی وصیت تھی. اب یہ جملے جناب ام کلثوم سن رہی تھی. آگے بڑھتی ہیں, امام سے عرض کرتی ہیں کہ بھیا جب سے ہم اس سرزمین میں وارد ہوئے ہیں تو میرے دل میں قلق ہے, میرے دل میں اضطراب ہے. کیا یہ نہیں ہو سکتا کہ ہم یہاں سے آگے بڑھ کے کہیں اور پہ اپنے خیمے لگا لیں؟ تو امام نے کہا اے بہن ام کلثوم, کیوں نہ آپ کو اضطراب ہوگا. یہی وہ جگہ ہے کہ جہاں پہ باس کے بازو قلم ہوں گے. یہی وہ جگہ ہے جہاں پہ جناب قاسم کی لاش پامال ہوگی. یہی وہ جگہ ہے جہاں پہ ششمہار اصغر شہید ہوں گے. امام نے پھر ایک واقعہ بیان کیا. فرمایا کہ ہم صفین کے راستے میں تھے اور راستے میں بابا امیر المومنین ایک مرتبہ آرام فرمانے لگے تو اپنے سر کو بھیا حسن کے زانوں پہ رکھا, مختصر آرام فرمایا اور پھر آنسو بہانا شروع کیا, رونے لگے. امام حسن نے دریافت کیا بابا خیریت, کیوں آپ رو رہے ہیں؟ امام نے جواب دیا کہ میری آنکھ لگی تھی تو میں نے دیکھا کہ اس صحرا میں چاروں طرف خون کا دریا ہے اور میرا حسین اس خون کے دریا میں غرق ہے. چاروں طرف خون ہے اور امام استغاثہ دے رہے ہیں. هل من مغيث يغيثنا بوجه الله, هل من ذاب يذب عن حرم رسول الله. اور امام اکیلے کھڑے ہیں, کوئی جواب نہیں دے رہا. روز عاشوراء یہی ہوا. امام جدھر دیکھتے ہیں تو ایک شقی کھڑا ہے, کوئی تلوار ہاتھ میں لیے ہے, کوئی نیزہ ہاتھ میں لیا ہے. اور اس وقت بس صدائے 2 آوازیں گونج رہی تھی صحرائے کربلا میں. ایک جناب زینب پکار رہی تھی اخی اخی, اور ایک بوڑھی ماں